Hello, I'm Michael Wunsch. I'm the plant pathologist at the North Dakota State University Carrington Research Extension Center. I'd like to take a moment to share with you results from our fungicide efficacy testing in chickpeas for management of Ascochyta blight. These are results through the 2024 field season. This presentation was prepared in April of 2025. Briefly, the methods. Testing was conducted on Kabuli type chickpeas with partial Ascochyta resistance, i.e. reduced susceptibility, adapted to the northern plains. Testing was conducted generally on CDC Frontier, Leader, or Orion. Row spacing, 7 inches. Seeding rate was 4.5 or 5 viable seeds per square foot. Fungicide spray volume, 15 gallons an acre in most studies, 17 or 17.5 gallons an acre in some of the early research conducted in 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, etc. Much of the testing was conducted with fungicides applied with a handheld boom pressurized by CO2. Some of the testing was conducted with a tractor-mounted PTO-driven sprayer, but this was testing just with Proline versus Proline plus Bravo weather stick. Fungicide droplet size was consistently fine in the testing conducted from 2009 to approximately 2022. After that, it was calibrated relative to canopy characteristics. Fine, medium, or coarse. So this would be testing done in 2023 and 2024. We applied as many fungicide applications as needed relative to rainfall patterns. Typically this was 3, 4, 5, or in really wet years, 6 applications, 10 to 14 days apart depending on the year. Okay, and the first application was made at the first appearance of disease symptoms or early bloom, whichever occurred first, and was never prior to late vegetative growth. We sometimes had an application interval that exceeded 10 to 14 days. When we had a dry stretch with no rain, we would extend that interval, just making sure that that application went on before the next rain. Then a number of experimental replicates was 4, 5, or 6, depending on the study. Disease development was facilitated by spreading very small quantities of overwinter disease chickpeas residues, usually a stem or two, during vegetative growth to the non-harvested plots that separate every single treatment plot. Ascochyta was assessed concurrent with the first fungicide application and then a minimum 2 times during pod fill, and is reported on a 0 to 100 scale that summarizes the percent of the canopy that was diseased between that first fungicide application and that last disease assessment on average during that period. Yield is assessed based on the measured plot length and also the grain moisture at harvest, and we report all the yields at a standard 13.5% moisture level. Okay, for more details on the methods as well as details for results from individual field studies, see the corresponding PDF that I have uploaded that has detailed fungicide efficacy results across every single study and for every single fungicide. What I'm going to present in this presentation are just average results across all the studies. Okay, so if we're comparing 2 products, you're looking at averages across multiple studies. If you want the detailed results of how consistently a fungicide performed, you want to look at that corresponding PDF that contains the detailed fungicide testing results. And those PDFs also contain more detailed methods about how every single one of these studies was conducted. Very good. I'm now going to transition to discussing the most effective fungicides. These would be Proline, 5.7 fluid ounces, plus Bravo weather stick at 1.38 pints, and Provisol at 5 fluid ounces plus Bravo weather stick at 1.38 pints. Now, this is a tank mix, and I would give you the warning that Bravo weather stick is sticky, just like the name says. Okay, and so when you add this to the tank, you should keep the agitation on the entire time, and once you're done spraying, you should flush your boom. So you need to clean out your sprayer and clean out your boom, because if you leave this to settle, any small quantity of this to settle, or you leave your nozzles unflushed, you'll have problems with nozzles being plugged and even screens being plugged in the sprayer. Okay, results. Proline applied alone is consistently less effective than Proline plus Bravo Weather Stick. This slide shows combined results across multiple studies at every level of disease pressure. And what you'll see is that adding the Bravo to the tank sharply improves Ascochyta management at all levels of pressure. And this is the reason why, even though this product is thick and sticky, it's worth working with. It greatly improves your disease management. It's worth the effort. This tank mix with Bravo Weather Stick is optimized when Proline is applied at the high end of the labeled rate and Bravo Weather Stick is applied at the low end of the labeled rate. Yes, you can get some degree of additional gain by increasing the rate of Bravo Weather Stick to 2 pints an acre from 1.38, but it's very slight. The big gain comes from having Proline applied at the full rate of 5.7 fluid ounces. So if you want to optimize disease management while keeping your costs down, you apply Proline at the high rate and Bravo Weather Stick at the low rate. 5.7 fluid ounces plus 1.38 pints. Provisol, a triazole fungicide from BSF that has the same mode of action as Proline, also works very well against Ascochyta blight, and it responds to the tank mix with Bravo Weather Stick very strongly, just like Proline. Provisol exhibits a rate response, just like Proline. So the high end of the label rate is better than the low end of the label rate. 5 fluid ounces performs better than 3 fluid ounces. Here's some more data illustrating that. So here's the combined analysis across all studies where we evaluated 3 fluid ounces of Provisol versus 5.7 of Proline. What you notice is that there's a very clear trend here where the 5.7 fluid ounce rate of Proline is providing better disease control and better yields under Ascochyta pressure than 3 fluid ounces of Provisol. Look at now Provisol at 5 fluid ounces, you see the reverse. Now that you got Provisol at a high rate, you can see a very clear trend where the Provisol is giving you better disease control and higher yields under Ascochyta pressure than the Proline. When tank mixing chlorothalonil with an active ingredient Bravo Weather Stick with Proline or Provisol, generic and brand name versions of chlorothalonil are equivalent. This is in testing conducted on Bravo Weather Stick, Praise, and ECU 720. So Bravo Weather Stick is the brand name version. And last I checked, the price of Bravo Weather Stick was significantly higher than the price of Praise and ECU 720. This is combined analysis across 9 studies, 7 conducted with Proline and 2 with Provisol. What you can see is that there's no difference in efficacy across these chlorothalonil products. Use the one that's most cost effective. Okay, we're now ready to move on to rotational chemistries with alternate modes of action. I've discussed the fungicides that are most effective, but realize that Proline and Provisol are the exact same mode of action. It's good to have other modes of action in our mix as we look to manage Ascochyta blight so as to minimize the chance of resistance development. The best option for getting another mode of action into your rotation is Miravis Top. Miravis Top contains a triazole, again same mode of action as Proline and Provisol, but it's pre-mixed with an SDHI fungicide that's still working, at least working reasonably well. And again, you want to apply this in a tank mix with Bravo Weather Stick. Your only other option, well, you got 2 other options. One is to apply Omega, which actually has pretty good efficacy against Ascochyta blight of chickpeas. But the problem is Omega is prohibitively expensive. So then your next option is to actually use a fungicide that's a premix of either Proline or Provisol with one of these fungicides that has for which the pathogen has developed resistance. Now this might seem counterproductive, but sometimes these premixes are equal or cheaper in cost to the standalone product. So Delero, for instance, is cheaper than Proline, and Rebuloc is cheaper than Provisol. And even though the premix contains another active ingredient that applied alone isn't effective, what you have to realize is that the Ascochyta population always consists of a mixture of sensitive and resistant strains of the Ascochyta pathogen. When you apply a fungicide that contains the full rate of, say, Provysol with another active ingredient that for which the Ascochyta pathogen has developed resistance, you're going to get the same activity out of that fungicide from the Provysol component as you would by applying Provysol alone. And then that additional active ingredient for which resistance has developed will still have activity at least on one application per season against the strains of Ascochyta that remain sensitive to that. Because remember, you're always going to have a mixture of sensitive and resistant types. Or in most cases, you're going to have a mixture. So, as counterintuitive as it might be, including one spray of a premixed fungicide that contains one of these actives, say headliner quadris, active in headliner quadris, so a strobe, or the active ingredient in Priaxor, fluxaperoxide, and SCHI, that for which resistance is developed can actually give you some degree of benefit. It's going to be slight, but as long as you're applying the active ingredient, proline or Provysol, at the full rate, equivalent to a full rate of proline or Provysol, and the product is equal or less in cost, there you can only gain from this practice. I would just recommend not applying it more than once in season, because you do not want to put too much selection pressure on those sensitive strains. Okay, that said, let's move to Mirabis top. The SCHI fungicide, the FRAX 7 fungicide in this product still appears to have some efficacy. Applied alone, Proline versus Mirabis top have performed equivalently in our testing. When we've added the Bravo Weather Stick, we've seen the same response in terms of reduced disease severity with this tank mix. We haven't seen the response in yield though, and possibly this is due to some degree of noise in our yield data, but it certainly suggests that this tank mix might not be quite as good as the Proline Bravo Weather Stick tank mix. Another point of evidence that this tank mix might not be quite as good comes from this study conducted in Carrington in 2024, where we tested rotational strategies. Okay, so we tested Proline alone, applied sequentially all season, versus Proline tank mix with Mirabis Neo, Mirabis Top, or this new product from BSF called Zorina. Zorina is a premix of Provysol 5 fluid ounces and Endura 6 ounces at the application rate of Zorina that we tested. So we tested those sequentially, those products without a chlorothalonil tank mix partner, okay, either sequential Proline or these rotations. We tested that against Proline plus Bravo sequentially versus these various rotations. What you'll notice is that the Mirabis Top tank mixed with Bravo, rotated with Proline tank mixed with Bravo, conferred a statistically lower yield than the Proline tank mixed with Bravo. Okay, and the disease data correspond even if you didn't have statistical separation. So the take home is that Mirabis Top is a decent rotational product with Proline, but it's best applied when disease pressure is moderate. In 2024, we had a very wet summer in Carrington, one of the wettest summers I've seen in the 15 years I've worked here. And so this was extreme pressure, and these were extreme conditions. And Mirabis Top is best applied when disease pressure is more moderate, and you want to keep that tank mix with Bravo Weather Stick at all times, even if the response is a little bit lower, because we do see an improvement in the disease management, and here it's statistically significant, and at least here we're seeing that response in yield. Okay, if you notice in that last graph. One of the other products that we tested was Miravis Neo. Now, Miravis Neo has that same SDHI in Miravis Top, but it's premixed with two other active ingredients that have essentially zero efficacy against Ascochyta blight, except the azoxystrobin, which may confer some degree of efficacy against those limited number of strains in that field that are still sensitive to the strobies, which might give you a benefit in the first application, but not thereafter. What you can see here in the combined analysis across 10 studies is that the Miravis Neo is not quite as strong as the Proline, at least in terms of the consistent trends that we see. But this is really not all the story. If you look at the efficacy of Proline versus Miravis Neo over time, what you can see in our testing conducted through 2021, these two products applied alone without a tank mix partner were equivalent. Starting in 2022, we saw a separation between these two products where the Proline applied alone without a tank mix partner was more effective than the Miravis Neo. But yet the Miravis Neo still had some degree of efficacy. So what this suggests is that we might have resistance developing to that SDHI, but it's not yet at a high enough level that the Miravis Neo is completely ineffective. But realize that goes back to my previous comment about the Miravis Top. The Miravis Top relies on this SDHI, and if it does appear that we have resistance developing here, in which case you can expect that Miravis Top is going to be a risky choice when disease pressure is high. And you definitely want to have the Miravis Top tank mixed with Bravo Weatherstick. Relative to yield data, we're seeing a consistent trend relative to the performance of Proline versus Miravis Neo over this whole period, including the most recent period from 2022 to 2024, in that the Miravis Neo is just slightly less effective than Proline. And again, in my estimation, this points to the fact that any resistance that's out there is not yet at a very high level, because essentially our first couple applications are still delivering fairly decent disease management. We still have a fairly high number of sensitive strains of Ascochyta in the population. Okay, so here is the data on Miravis Neo applied alone versus with Bravo Weatherstick. You can see in this case, this fungicide is responding very strongly to Bravo Weatherstick. And given the fact that I have just described that there are likely some resistance issues developing for this SDHI, applying this with Bravo Weatherstick becomes imperative. But again, because we have these apparent resistance problems, it would be the better part of wisdom to actually apply Miravis Top instead of Miravis Neo, because Miravis Top has a much more effective triazole premix partner. So again, going back to the same data that I presented earlier, you can see here that Miravis Neo is not quite as strong as the Miravis Top applied in rotation with Proline, whether it's the Prolines, whether these fungicides applied alone or with that take mix partner. There is not statistical separation between the Neo and Top here, but there is a clear trend. And I guess there is statistical separation for the Neo and Top disease data when they're applied alone, but otherwise it's a very clear trend. Okay, so the Miravis Top is a better choice. But again, under very high disease pressure like this study, it can be overwhelmed. And so Miravis Top is best applied when disease pressure is moderate. Your other rotational choice for a different mode of action is Omega. This has a completely different mode of action. The only problem here is the cost. Omega is very, very expensive, especially applied at this rate. And there is a rate response at Omega with higher application rates performing better than low rates. So your only other option for including other modes of action in your rotation is to include a fungicide that's a premix with actives in Proline and Provysol. Make sure you apply that fungicide such that you're getting the label rate of Proline and Provysol. But even if that premix contains active ingredients that are no longer effective when applied alone. So Revitec, for instance, is mefentrifluconazole, the active in Provysol, premixed with pyraclostrobin, the active in Headline, and fluxaperoxide, Now, pyraclostrobin and fluxoperoxide are the actives in Priaxar. Now, Ascochyta has developed resistance to headline and has developed apparent resistance to Priaxar. So if you were to apply pyraclostrobin or fluxoperoxide alone, that fungicide is not going to work. But as long as you're applying it in a premix with mefentrifluconazole at the same rate as is labeled in Provisol, adding the pyraclostrobin and fluxoperoxide can add some degree of value if you have some proportion of your Ascochyta strains sensitive to those, which we typically do. You're going to have a certain proportion of the strains that are resistant and a certain proportion that are sensitive in almost all circumstances. And so if you just limit it to one spray per season, you might see a bit of a boost because those other actives will provide some activity against the sensitive strains. After that one application, you can expect that you'll have selective for resistance in that field, and so subsequent applications won't give you a boost, but the first application might. So looking at this strategy, Revitec applied at 9 fluid ounces delivers the same amount of mefentrifluconazole as Provisol at 3 fluid ounces. And all you do is get bonus other actives that may provide some activity against the sensitive strains of the pathogen to those actives. Reviloc, 6.5 fluid ounces of Reviloc delivers the same amount of mefentrifluconazole as Provisol at 4.9 fluid ounces. And the low rate of Reviloc delivers the same amount of mefentrifluconazole as Provisol at 3.4 fluid ounces. So this gives you another avenue for applying that full rate range of Provisol. Delero is a premix of prothioconazole and trifloxystrobin, prothioconazole and trifloxystrobin. And Delero at 12 fluid ounces delivers the same amount of prothioconazole at Proline as at 4.5 fluid ounces. Now notice the rate here. This rate here is too low. The full labeled rate of Proline is 5 to 5.7 fluid ounces, and I've already shown you data showing that you should be applying at that 5.7 fluid ounce rate. So if you're going to apply Delero, you need to add to the tank additional Proline. So you add 1.2 fluid ounces of Proline to that 12 fluid ounces of Delero to bring your total application rate up to 5.7 fluid ounces. Now, surprisingly, that Delero plus Proline has traditionally been cheaper than Proline alone, and the Reviloc has been cheaper than Provisol alone. So economically, this might be an option. But again, I would only expect any benefit to be moderate in scope and only confer any benefit in the first application made within a season. Here's some data on Revitec at 8 fluid ounces versus Provisol at 3 fluid ounces, and you can see a very slight trend where that Revitec at 8 fluid ounces, which is actually a little bit lower than a 3 fluid ounce rate of Provisol, is actually performing slightly better. So there is some merit to having these other actives in the tank, even if they're not providing much efficacy anymore. Delero at 12 fluid ounces, on the other hand, is less effective than Proline at 5.7. I know this is a trend, but it's a very strong and consistent one. Remember, the Delero at 12 fluid ounces is equivalent to 4.5 fluid ounces of Proline, and the key here is that you need to make sure that your application rate of the target active, in this case the active in Proline, does not drop too low. So in this case, you need to add 1.2 fluid ounces of Proline to that Delero in order to maintain your activity. Okay, so finally, what I'd like to cover are fungicides with poor activity against Ascochyta. These would be Priaxar, Endura, and then Headline, Quadris, and Approach, and all the rest of the QOIs. So we have resistance that has developed to the QOI fungicides, the FRAC 11 fungicides, and we have apparent resistance that has developed against Priaxar and SCHI. So Priaxar is a premix of fluxoperoxide, that SCHI, and pyraclostrobin, the active in Headline. And we had resistance development a long time ago to Headline, and now we appear to have it for fluxoperoxide. What you can see is that the testing conducted since 2021 that we have no activity anymore from the Priaxar. So here's a look at why I'm saying this appears to be resistance development. We don't, to my knowledge, have the laboratory work done to confirm the resistance, but you can see that prior to 2020, we consistently got very good disease management out of Praxer, targeting Ascochyta and chickpeas. Starting in 2020, the efficacy dropped to basically zero. The same is true for the yields. The yields through 2019 were consistently strong from applying Praxer for Ascochyta management and chickpeas. 2020 was a transition year where we have reduced yields, but not catastrophic. 2021 and on, you can see that our yields are essentially averaging zero. Endura is another fungicide that has never performed very well against Ascochyta blight on chickpeas. But critically, once the fluxaperoxide failed in Praxer, suddenly now the Endura also has not been showing any efficacy, not just poor efficacy, but zero efficacy. So when one SDHI fails, typically some of the other ones do, but not all of them. So in this case, it looks like the Endura might have failed concurrently with the Praxer. Again, the laboratory testing has not been done to confirm that, but just based on fungicide performance. Okay, so what have we learned? Proline and Provisol, tank mixed with Bravo Weather Stick, are most effective. And to achieve the best disease management, you need to apply Proline at the high end of the label rate, 5.7 fluid ounces, and Provisol at the high end of the label rate at 5 fluid ounces. Miravis Top is the best rotational fungicide with an alternate mode of action because that SDHI still shows some degree of activity, even though it does appear that some resistance development might be developing. It is best applied tank mixed with Bravo Weather Stick or generic because, again, of this apparent resistance development at some degree to the SDHI active ingredient. This will give you, adding the Bravo will give you a much greater degree of protection if that resistance is developing and if it becomes more of a problem. And then this tank mix is best applied when the disease pressure is moderate. Miravis Top plus Bravo Weather Stick is not as good as Proline plus Bravo Weather Stick. Okay, and it's not as good as Provisol plus Bravo Weather Stick. It is a way to get another mode of action in the rotation, and it is a viable option when the disease pressure is moderate. But when disease pressure is high, it's not your best choice. Okay, your only other option are premixed fungicides like the main active ingredients in Proline and Provisol. But you need to make sure that you're applying those products such that you're getting a full rate of Proline or Provisol. Otherwise, they will perform like a cut rate of Proline and Provisol. With that, I would like to sincerely thank my staff who have contributed to this research. Aaron Faust, Jesse Hafner, Gabby Henson, Swan Collis. These are my current staff members. They all work very hard and are very dedicated. And then former staff members who contributed to this: Thomas Miorini, Michael Schaefer, Billy Kraft, as well as our ongoing seasonal staff who assist. It's the extraordinary dedication of these staff that has made this research possible. I would also stress that some of this testing was conducted at the Wilson Research Center. Audrey Kalile, when she was a pathologist there, she led that research. Edson and Cube has now subsequently taken over the leadership of that program, and he is now leading that type of collaborative work. And Tyler Teldy used to lead that research before Audrey got to Williston. And Tyler is the irrigation agronomist, and then their various staff. So sincere thanks to all of them, and thanks to the funding sponsors, the Northern Pulse Growers Association, the USDA Specialty Crop Block Grant Program administered by the North Dakota Department of Agriculture, the North Dakota Crop Protection Product Harmonization Registration Board administered by the North Dakota Department of Agriculture, and then the private companies. And I would stress that the funding from the private companies also is flexible funding, and that's the funding that we utilize in order to purchase our equipment needed to execute these studies. So the tractors, the sprayers, the combine, actually, our plot combine, this critical farm equipment is purchased using these resources. With that, thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope this information helps improve your operations.